Celiac disease is a balance of mental health and physical health. And I'm finding the mental health is being challenged by some of the social media messages.
Social media is a double-edged sword when it comes to health information.
Celiac disease, we would say it's 1 in 80 males and 1 in 60 females, so 1 in 70 people. It's twofold. It's got this damage that occurs to the intestine, and it's got a set of symptoms, and about 20% of people don't have symptoms. And that can be more dangerous, in fact. There's a lot of adjustment that they need to make, and their friends and their family around them, to help support them. A lot of people will say they might not be comfortable with eating out for 2 or even up to 5 years later.
Do we trust going to restaurants and dining out?
I have seen anxiety really just go through the roof. At some level, you have to be able to trust food, otherwise you're a mess.
Kim, thank you for joining me on this show. I'm so excited to have you here. We've been speaking for the last 10 minutes and there is so much information that you've shared already. I know it was for a very different disease, but you're just filled with so much information, and I'm so excited for you to come on the show and share all of your valuable insights and your expertise. Thank you so much for joining me.
Mal, thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm very passionate about celiac disease, so you may have to reel me in just a little bit, but we'll see where we head.
We just had to get reeled in just then because we were deep into a conversation about hives and low histamine, and then we're like, okay, we should probably start recording now.
Yes.
But everything that you've just shared was so insightful, and I know there's so much that you can share with our audience now, particularly about celiac. But before we get into it, I'd love for you to just introduce yourself to our audience. Who are you, Kim? What's your background, your expertise, and what makes you so passionate about celiac and food intolerances?
So I'm Kim Faulkner-Hogg. So I'm a dietitian. You can see by the grey that I've had quite a few years of experience. And I was given an opportunity, we're going back to the 90s, of being able to do a PhD with people who had celiac disease. And I took that opportunity, and it was, eye-opening into the whole area of celiac disease. And so we were looking at the minutiae, I call it, not everybody else does, but very small amounts of gluten that might be in a gluten-free diet. And we're looking at ongoing symptoms in people that had celiac disease. So at the time I'm working at the Food Allergy and Food Intolerance Clinic at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. And so I got to see a lot of people and develop an interest in this disease. I've then gone into a private practice, and I see people with celiac disease in private practice and do a lot of other consulting and, bits of work in that sort of space of gluten-free eating.
How common was celiac back then in like the 90s versus now?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We used to say when I was a student that a celiac disease was about 1 in every 2,500 people. We're now saying sort of globally, if we put it together in developed countries, it's 1 in 100. In Australia, we would say it's 1 in 80 males and 1 in 60 females, so 1 in 70 people.
And what do you think has caused celiac to be more predominant now?
I think we understand the disease better. Unless you actually presented, and it was actually thought of as a childhood disorder too up until about the 1970s. So in those kids, they had these really pot bellies and wasted leg muscles and loads of diarrhoea. And by the time we recognised it in adults again, unless they were skinny with loads of diarrhoea, they didn't think that you had celiac disease, so never tested for it. But we now know that you can be overweight, constipated and have celiac disease. So we have better testing methods. The better testing methods have allowed us to test a wider variety of people and find out, oh, look, it's in, far more people. We know that the symptoms now extend way beyond just diarrhoea and weight reduction. And it's actually a bit of a diagnostic challenge for doctors across all spans of medicine, because there are so many symptoms in so many different groups that people really need to be aware of it. And that has started to happen. So therefore more people are being tested, and the prevalence is just like, wow, it's much bigger than it used to be.
So what is celiac? So for our audience, how can you in its simplest form describe what celiac is and what the common symptoms are?
Okay. So inside us, if we swallow our food, it comes through here, through the esophagus, into the stomach churns it round, it becomes a liquid. Then it gets released into what we call the small intestine. So I tell people, imagine your garden hose wound up inside of you. So your garden hose is round. you've got these, finger-like projections, which we call villi, which line the gastrointestinal tract all the way through. They've got mechanisms on them that say can grab our iron and pull it across, grab our calcium, pull it across, grab protein, pull it across. Pulling it across, I mean putting it into our bloodstream, so therefore we can use it or store it. What happens with celiac disease is when we eat something called gluten, it affects the villi and it causes damage to them such that they contract like this. Now, when we've got normal villi, we could pull it out. If we could flatten that gut, we'd have 1 to 2 tennis courts of space for food to rush all over. When we've got really flat gut, we've got about an A4 sheet of paper size that our gut is, that it's trying to absorb nutrients. Because it's not absorbing them, they're passing through. And that's why we can get so many different diseases from lack of absorption of nutrients. So that's what we're looking at. Celiac disease is twofold. It's got this damage that occurs to the intestine, and it's got a set of symptoms, and about 20% of people don't have symptoms. And that can be more dangerous, in fact, because it might be quite prolonged before they end up with a diagnosis and might have other, diseases that have developed in their life because of that.
Wow, I actually didn't know that. So for those that are experiencing symptoms, what do they typically experience?
So our typical symptoms we would think of as gastrointestinal. So it could be the reflux, the nausea, vomiting, pain, wind, cramping, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, and changes of that. We now know that we've moved outside of that. So we call that gastrointestinal. So other symptoms are extra-intestinal, meaning outside of the gastrointestinal tract. And some of those common ones are brain fog. It can be headaches, migraines, changes in mood, anxiety, depression. So that's kind of like another set of symptoms that are common. Some people do get skin rashes. There's in fact something called celiac disease of the skin, which is really itchy, intensely itchy blisters on the elbows, knees and buttocks. I have seen it on other parts of the body as well, and that will respond to gluten removal. But then it can impact things like fertility. So some people may not find out they actually have celiac disease until they have difficulties falling pregnant. Then they get diagnosed. Then they need a period of time to go gluten-free so that this actually grows back again such that they can support a baby. It can affect sperm health too. This isn't just the women. It can affect sperm health. So the infertility side might be more on the male than it is on the female. We get people who can have a lot of mouth ulcers. Some people hair falls out. So, there's a whole, which is why I'm saying that for the doctors, it can be a bit of a nightmare because it seems to be in many things. You've got ataxia, which is a bit of a way people walk. And it was described to me that you walk with a bit of a roll because your coordination of your muscles can be a bit hard. You put someone on a gluten-free diet, they can walk normally. Some people get sort of epilepsy. So not all epilepsy is related to gluten or celiac disease. But certainly for some people, it's undiagnosed that they have celiac disease, and when we put them on a gluten-free diet, we can decrease the seizures that they're having. So it can impact a lot of places.
A lot of different symptoms, right?
Yeah.
So what is your recommendation when it comes to testing? Should we get tested anyway? Should we wait till we feel a particular way?
Okay. Now, what I would really like to get out there if we could is if you think it's a problem, don't take gluten out of the diet.
Yeah.
Because once you take it out of the diet, you can't test for celiac disease. The way we treat celiac disease is to take gluten out of the diet. Therefore, the measures in the blood and these villi that the gastroenterologist would measure, well, they start to improve. So if someone says to you, let's just take it out and see how you feel, I'm going, no, please don't do that. Go to the doctor while you've got these quantities of gluten in, because something we see in a small set of people, not everyone, is that once you've taken it out of the diet, it's actually harder to put back in because you become a little bit more symptomatic than you were. So if you take it out and then I want to know, well, look, are we dealing with celiac disease or intolerance? Because how we deal with them is slightly different. I really need to know if you've got celiac disease. So you actually have to put 2 to 4 slices of bread back into the diet every single day for 6 weeks so that then when they test you, we know that we're going to get an antibody response. So there's particular antibodies which are called celiac-specific antibodies. They should be raised, and they should be significantly raised, not just a little bit. Then we need to have a small bowel biopsy, because we don't have a blood test which is 100% specific for celiac disease. So therefore, sometimes when it's a little bit raised, it may be due to something else that's happening, which is why there's a number of tests we want positive, plus we want the small bowel biopsy to actually show that it's damaged as well.
So you did mention something which I think is quite interesting, and I really wanted to touch on this topic. What is the difference between celiac and gluten intolerance?
So if people have a gluten intolerance, they can have many of the symptoms which we see with celiac disease. So all of those gastrointestinal symptoms, and even the mouth ulcers that I talked about, the brain fog type of symptoms, can be associated with gluten. The ones that I said were, say, infertility, they're more related to the malabsorption of the nutrients, and therefore this has led to something else. People who have a gluten intolerance have normal villi. So they are absorbing their nutrients. So they don't have the diseases that may come, or the conditions that may come from malabsorption, like low blood iron, and that's a reason for fatigue. They won't necessarily have that if they're intolerant, because they should be absorbing, but they're going to have all of the same sort of symptoms. So the way we would look at dealing with their diet is you need to reduce gluten to the level that you're comfortable living with your symptoms. Whereas, as I mentioned with celiac disease, there's 20% of people who don't actually have symptoms. They still have to take it out, because now it's about their villi and being able to get the villi. So they need to have gluten out. So this grows back. So their absorption of nutrients is good, and that will help to prevent some of the long-term medical conditions that might come down the track.
That was going to take me to my next question. I often hear people in like my friendship group, or people that I know that are celiac, and they're like, oh, I'm celiac, but I'm out for dinner tonight, or whatever. I'm just going to have some bread, or I'm just going to have some gluten, and I'll just deal with it later. Like, it's fine. But what are the actual issues that can come from someone who is celiac that is just like, I'm just going to have gluten tonight, it doesn't matter? Like, what is the damage that can be caused?
So I always come from the point of view, whereas I never say to people, you can never do anything, it's your life to do with what you want. But the medical side in me is that really you shouldn't, a person with celiac disease shouldn't go out and have pieces of bread, because there's like 2,000 milligrams of gluten that you're going to be ingesting with that piece of bread. And that's a definite bang that's going to happen. You will not wipe all of the villi out in your gut with one piece of bread. But one piece of bread has got something, as I said, 2,000 milligrams of gluten in it. In the background of a gluten-free diet, it's thought that maybe 10 milligrams is safe. So if they've gone out and had 2,000 milligrams in one hit and 10 is safe, then there will be some level of damage that's been done inside. And it takes the body a while to get on top of this. It's not like it's going to be okay next week. It can take, on average, people who go gluten-free at the beginning of their diagnoses, even up to 1 to 2 years for their villi to grow back to normal. So if once a week you're going to go out and have a piece of bread, your villi is never going to be on the normal scale at all. You're always going to be having some level of damage there, and that level of damage is therefore going to impact the nutrients that you're absorbing, your bone health, your absorption of the iron, and then some of those other medical conditions that could eventuate just because we've been malabsorbing nutrients for a long time.
It's quite serious, isn't it?
It is serious, and that is something that is a big difference in terms of that medical outcome for the people with celiac disease versus the people who have intolerance.
Yeah. And so being told that you're celiac is not something someone wants to hear, right?
No.
And it may be something that, a piece of news that you might get delivered to you as you get older. You may be someone that doesn't experience symptoms, may have had some issues with fertility, and then you get tested for celiac and you find out that you are now a celiac. So how do you actually, for someone who enjoys dining out, it's a big part of their life, socializing, they've never had to worry about any exclusion in their diet because they've never felt any sort of discomfort. What are your recommendations to them to be able to continue on living life as normal as a now celiac?
There's a lot of adjustment that they need to make, and their friends and their family around them, to help support them. And it doesn't happen overnight. And, a lot of people will say they might not be comfortable with eating out for 2 or even up to 5 years later.
Wow.
So they have to understand their disease, why they need to go gluten-free, where the gluten is. I teach it in terms of gluten-rich, gluten-poor and gluten-free, so that we can really attack what is I consider to be gluten-rich, needs to come out like your pieces of bread. And there's you controlling your meal, and then there's a restaurant controlling the meal, and then there's mum controlling the meal when you go to visit. Then your best friend who's controlling the meal when you go to visit. And each of those places needs to understand where there could be some possible sort of cross-contact with gluten and how that may or may not affect the person that they're dealing with. So there are parts that need to be taken on by everybody with celiac disease, which is definitely the pieces of bread, gluten-rich, really need to come out of the diet if, we're doing the best to decrease the risks so that we have the better health sort of going forward. And then there's that 10 milligrams of gluten that I talked about that is considered, safe in the background of a gluten-free diet. And believe me, the first question people ask is, well, what can I eat that's 10 milligrams?
I was just about to ask that.
Yeah. Nothing. I'm sorry. When we get to that, we are literally talking about, well, can I go to mum's, and if she's cooked me gluten-free muffins, can I trust that her kitchen was clean enough such that we didn't have cross-contact? Wow. So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at, can I have a may contain statement? Can I have a cross-contact? What about, a toast, that's a piece of toast that's been cooked in a toaster that also cooked wheat bread? We're talking this tiny level, which we call cross-contact. We're not talking about any piece of bread. If you look at crumbs in the butter, and if you get crumbs that's probably, the size of, if you can just see that little bit of fingernail that comes across the top of my fingers there, that's about 10 milligrams of gluten in bread. So we're talking nothing that anybody can go out and ingest.
Wow, you never really think about that cross contact.
No.
That is just wild. So this is a very broad question, but how much gluten exists in food? So how does someone assess that? I know that there's, the back of packaging and you can look at nutrition labels, but what about your foods that may not contain nutritional labels that you go to bakeries or you get from the fresh fruit and, even meats that can potentially have some gluten in it. How do you know, and how much does food contain?
So gluten is never going to be on a label in terms of the quantity. Gluten we know exists in wheat, rye, barley, and in this country we put oats into the mix as well. Look, oats is a topic I don't think we should even get into today because it'll just take too long.
I was just about to ask you a question about oats. But
all right, well, I'll see if I can zip it down. But let's just say, we talk about wheat, rye, barley and oats. So people look for those names on a food label, and then if they see those names, there's gluten in it. But it's never going to tell you that this piece of bread that I've bought has contained 2 grams of gluten. So the piece of bread, it could be 1.5 grams, it could be up to 3 grams. It will depend on your ingredients. But it is what I call gluten-rich. So actual flour, be it barley flour, rye flour, wheat flour, they've got lots of protein in it. The gluten is in the protein portion of the grain. So any biscuit, cake, pasta is all going to be equivalent in huge. We shouldn't be having that with celiac disease. And then if you've got your flour, you grind it down to a flour, you can wash it with water, you can separate out the protein from the starch. Now the starch is a carbohydrate. So in theory it's not protein, but a tiny bit of protein clings to it. So it's not completely free, and you can measure gluten in it. But I would call that something that's gluten poor, because people prior to the year 2000, if we just do round figures, a gluten-free diet from 1950 to the year 2000 contained wheat starch, because you couldn't actually detect the gluten content at that point until about the 80s, and it was Australian who actually determined how you could detect gluten in foods, and that's why Australia has used this in its food standard. So if you can detect gluten in a food, you can't call it gluten-free. So tiny little things like thickeners and starches and maltodextrin and things derived from the starches, which are essentially sugars, can carry a tiny bit of gluten in it. And our advice for people with celiac disease today is do your best to try to avoid those things, and take them out of the diet. That's what I'm sort of looking at as gluten poor foods. And then you've got gluten-free. So there are some ingredients derived from wheat that are so refined that there's no gluten left in them. And one of them is glucose syrup. And you're going to find that in a lot of chocolate and in a lot of ice cream. So we need to teach people how to read a food label. And so that is one of the really big advantages by going and actually seeing somebody to know, because I have a lot of clients who have done it themselves. So they've looked at glucose syrup in chocolate and it says it contains wheat, or it says, that it's from wheat. And they go, I can't have chocolate. Oh, wow, I can't have chocolate. I'm like, well, no, you can actually have glucose syrup from wheat because there's no detectable gluten in it. So that's actually going to bring back some of these chocolates.
So you can have all the chocolate and ice
Not
cream that you want.
Not all the chocolates. There are still ingredients like barley malt extract, barley malt and a few other things. But it's a learning curve, you can see. So it helps.
So what is the most surprising food that contains gluten that shocks a lot of your clients, where they're like, I had no idea that had gluten in it?
Well, chocolates and ice creams can be some of them because ice cream is dairy. And gluten is in grains, wheat, rye, barley, oats, it's in grains. You don't think of the dairy food as grains. So when you were looking at that glucose syrup from wheat, which I'm saying now is okay, you used to have people go, well, I can't have that. But if you're going to have cookies and cream as ice cream, well, then you couldn't have that in it. But you literally have to check everything. Sauces, you don't think of sauces as a grain, but if the sauce has got a thickener in it, well, then you're going to need to check that. Soy sauce is soy, isn't it? So to make soy sauce, they actually put in this umami flavour, which they get from hydrolyzing wheat. So if the wheat's 100% hydrolyzed, it will be gluten-free. But if it's not 100% hydrolyzed, it's going to contain some wheat amino acids that can represent gluten in it. And so people need to know, well, there could be flour in soy sauce. And so you need to not have that. Beer is one that people don't think about. Beer comes from the barley. There can be some wheat beers, but that can be a big shock to some people. Oh, I can't drink beer. It's like, yep, or have it in a casserole or have it in a marinade or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's just there's a lot of things that you need to be mindful of when you're celiac. So what are your thoughts when it comes to dining out? Because you did mention a lot about the cross-contamination. Do we trust going to restaurants and dining out?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around that?
Look, it's really difficult. At some level, you have to be able to trust food. Otherwise, you're a mess. And what is happening now since the year 2000, when we have pulled the diet in even further, is I have seen anxiety really just go through the roof when we're talking about all this level of cross-contact and what is it actually going to do. And so when we're going into a restaurant, we do teach people about questions that they can ask to try to ascertain how things may have been produced out the back. But each individual with celiac disease is an individual. So everyone with celiac disease doesn't get blah. Everyone is at risk of damage, but you will see with people that some people seem to have it a lot and some people are normal, and they will go to a restaurant and they will ask a set of questions and they're going to remain normal, and some are a little bit more twitchy. And so the type and the amount and the quantity of questions that you may ask when you're at a restaurant will depend on your disease and how it has affected you. If you are highly symptomatic, you are going to be asking far more questions at a restaurant, because I have had people who said, I can't get from the table to the toilet before it's either gone up or down, and from the reaction that they've had with gluten. Nobody wants to do that. And if that has happened, well, you can see the high anxiety that you're going to have within, eating at a restaurant. But people who don't have that as their experience or their reaction to the gluten in food may ask slightly different questions when they're at a restaurant. And some people are very uncomfortable asking questions, so they won't ask questions at all, which means we need to try to empower them to ask questions. And to the person who you're asking the question of needs to understand that this is a real issue. This is a real risk that this person is asking about.
Absolutely. I have a lot of appreciation, because going to restaurants, they do ask if you have any allergies or intolerances, which I as someone that doesn't, and you get asked that often, you're like, I'm fine, I'm all good. But for someone that could be dealing with some sort of intolerance or celiac disease, it is so important that they voice that and they ask all of those questions. And I know, Kim, I shared this with you, and I haven't spoken about this online, but being on this low histamine diet that I'm on and going out for dinner for the first time on Saturday, and having to ask, how do you prepare the mashed potato? What ingredients are in it? And having to you feel awkward because you're just like, oh, I don't want to ask because are they going to think I'm weird?
So I get people to start by doing it over the phone, and even if they're not
That's
intending
smart.
to go to a restaurant, it's kind of practice. All right.
Yeah.
So, you can go online, you can get a certain amount of information, but then I want you to call up and I want you to have a little bit of a spiel, so I give them a little bit of a spiel that they can, start with, that, they have celiac disease and this is not a fad, and, can they ask some questions about how they might help to keep their meal sort of safe out in the kitchen when it's being prepped. And, to have this number of questions. So if they do it over the phone, they can stumble and they can get themselves at least into that mode of how am I going to do and say this? They can get a response back from that person and understand what the types of responses might be that come back. So I actually want them to practice that before they get into a face-to-face situation.
Yeah. And do you think that for someone that's celiac that needs to exclude gluten, looking at a menu and seeing that it usually says GF, gluten-free, do you think that's enough? Or do you think, do you tell your clients to ask further questions?
I do. There's a statistic that says about 28% of Australians reduce or avoid gluten. So about 4 or 5% are reducing it for medical reasons, which includes the people with celiac disease and the people who are very sensitive but don't have celiac disease. And then you've got a lot of people who are doing it for lifestyle or belief systems. So because that's roughly 30% of the population, it behooves the restaurant to have a gluten-free choice, but it's often just gluten-free by ingredient. They don't consider how it's been put together and whether the component might have been deep fried in oil that's also deep fried wheat food. And so these are things that a person with celiac disease does need to ask. Did you just take this knife in the kitchen and cut that cake and now you've used that same knife without washing it on the gluten-free food? Have you put my food onto a cutting board which has got all sorts of crumbs of wheat on it and then mine slapped down on top of it while we've done something else? So these are the sorts of questions that they will need to ask. And it's, how many questions do I need to ask? Well, the questions will depend on the venue as well, and the type of food it is that you're wanting. But it's practice. And nobody's going to be perfect tomorrow. I've been diagnosed today and tomorrow everything is correct. And it's start with the big stuff that you can cope with and move through the layers of what is best for celiac disease as you get to be able to cope with one layer, move into the next. Some people do it all really well, but most people struggle. So break it down.
Yeah, that's a really good recommendation. I'm going to flip it. And I know you mentioned that 30% of Australians exclude gluten for various reasons. What is the harm in excluding gluten if you don't have an intolerance or a celiac or need to for medical reasons?
So it totally depends on what you end up eating. Some people just have it in their head that gluten-free is healthier. And if I go and buy the gluten-free cheesels, well, that's much better than buying the wheat-containing cheesels. It's like, nah, no, sorry, that doesn't equate that way. If we're looking at it, we're making a lifestyle choice to be gluten-free. You can have a healthy gluten-free diet, but swapping out a wheat food and putting in a gluten-free food is not nutritionally the same. And unfortunately, a lot of the gluten-free foods, which have, say, buckwheat or quinoa, the good grains in them, they're very strong, earthy flavour. So from a mouthfeel, they're not well liked in the beginning. You have to, the tastes grow on you. So in order to make the gluten-free products very similar to a white wheat type of pasta or a bread, we put a lot of starch and a lot of white rice flour into gluten-free products. Now, starch is a carbohydrate, no protein, no fat, no vitamins, no minerals. So if you've got 80% of your pasta being starch, you are not getting nutrients. You're getting this high glucose sort of carbohydrate load. Because there's not a lot of flavour in things, the sugar goes up, the fat goes up. So if we're in those highly processed packaged foods to replace the bread, the pasta, the biscuits, the gluten-free Tim Tam type of thing, you're getting not as good quality of nutrients that go into those products. So if you are unaware of that, your nutrition will actually be worse on a gluten-free diet than if you continue to eat your wheat, if we're just looking at nutrition and quality. Now, that doesn't mean that the people who are celiac can't make their gluten-free diet nutritious. They definitely can. We've only had wheat in the diet for, 12,000 years. Before that, we didn't cultivate wheat. So loads of natural, cultures around the world don't have the amount of wheat in it that we do. But you need to have more whole foods, unprocessed foods, have real quinoa, real buckwheat, and, not so much of the processed products. And there is a suggestion that we need to bring in even lentils and legumes in order to get our B vitamins, because the gluten-free foods are not fortified in the same way that the wheat foods are. But some people look at it more holistically, and they have the idea that gluten actually isn't good for their body. And they're wanting to sort of avoid it from what it may do in the future. And science hasn't said that this is a danger. So I'm just sort of saying there are different approaches. So again, if you've approached it from that angle, then you need to make sure you know how to make the diet nutritionally beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like you're so right. People think, I'm just going to be healthier if I eat gluten-free. But their substitutes, like you said, may not be as nutritious as if you would just have the real thing. But social media plays a really big part in all of that, right? Yeah, social media is a double-edged sword when it comes to health information.
Yeah.
What's your take when it comes to how it impacts the perception of celiac or even just like gluten-free in general?
Yeah. So I'm aware that a lot of people, when they do get the diagnoses, they will turn to Dr. Google or social media, in order to figure out, well, how do I do gluten-free? And a lot of the advice is gluten-free to, the nth degree, that you can never do X, Y, and Z. So it comes back to my concept that 10 milligrams a day is suitable for the majority of people with celiac disease. And a lot of the social media messages are all based on the actual zero. So a common one would be, don't put your piece of toast into a toaster that's also been using wheat bread because you're going to get glutened. And a lot of these pieces of advice came up when we had no research. But since about 2021, there's been a little bit of research at this tiny level. And one of the toaster researchers has actually shown, they went into a working kitchen. They hadn't cleaned the toasters. They had a pop-up toaster. You know those rolling ones? You put the bread in and it rolls around, it falls onto crumbs. They didn't clean them. They put 20 slices through the pop-up along with wheat. They put 20 gluten-free slices through the rolling along with wheat. They analysed them. There was no detectable gluten in any of the 20 pop-ups, and 16 of the ones that went through the rolling toaster had no detectable gluten, even though it dropped onto some tiny crumbs. 4 of them had detectable gluten, but in the international standard for gluten-free is 20 parts per million, and it's been designed so that people who eat a lot of commercial foods over the day won't get more than 10 milligrams of gluten in their diet. So these 4 pieces of bread, even though you could detect the gluten, it was less than the 20 parts per million. So we would say, in essence, those 40 pieces of bread could be eaten by people with celiac disease. So what I'm finding is the social media messages, which are all aimed at zero, and a lot of them are trying to find the tiniest amount of gluten that might be in a food. Sometimes that tiny amount of gluten is within that 10 milligrams. And so the person is highly scared and anxious because it's never explained what that little 1 crumb does. And so they form the wrong impression that 1 crumb wipes their gut out and they've lost everything in 1 crumb. And it's detrimental because celiac disease is a balance of mental health and physical health. And I'm finding the mental health is being challenged by some of the social media messages.
Yeah. Wow. I don't come across that type of content because I'm not celiac, so I don't see a lot of gluten-free recommendations. But if I was in that position and I was a new celiac, and I'm of course going to take a TikTok because everyone does, you find your answers on Reels, and you start to see that you need to do this and you need to have your own toaster and you need to do that, and it just becomes overwhelming. And you start to develop this sense of anxiousness when it comes to food, and that's exactly what you don't want.
Exactly. So you've got gluten itself can cause anxiety and depression. The gluten-free diet can cause the same. So what comes first, the chicken or the egg sometimes? And it's really difficult. But that's where I would have an hour session with my clients just on trace gluten. And I've gone through the literature and I've tried to find, well, what is in a shared fryer? What is in a shared toaster? What is in shared pasta cooking water? What is on that knife? How much is in lipstick? What is in toothpaste? This sort of stuff.
Lipstick?
So there's a message that you've been missing. So sometimes, again, the social media message might be you can only have beauty products and creams and things that don't contain any gluten in them, when the actual message is, unless you're trying to lick your shampoo off, it's got to get in here in order to do damage.
I didn't even know they contained gluten in them. I'm shocked at that level. But people are also saying you can't. Wow.
Yes. So if your shampoo's got gluten in it, for someone with celiac disease, that's not a problem. Lipstick, which potentially you can eat off and be swallowing. So there was a Facebook site, Tricia Thompson, who has the Gluten-Free Watchdog. She measures a lot of these sorts of things, and she did one where there were 4 lipsticks and lip balms that were tested that had gluten-containing ingredients in them, but all 4 came up with no detectable gluten. There was an Italian study that just went out and it bought popular lipsticks, couldn't care if there was gluten in it. We were just doing it because it's popular. Came back with about 36 lipsticks. None of them actually had gluten ingredients in them, but one had 27 parts per million contamination in it. Now, 27 parts per million is just above that international standard of what we would recommend as gluten-free. However, you would have to eat something like, 10, 12 entire tubes of lipstick to get 1 milligram of gluten at roughly that 27 parts per million of gluten. So if you've got one swipe across the lips, it'd be like 0.0000. I have done the math. I can't bring it up exactly. milligrams of gluten per swipe across the lips. And so I'm saying that is a message which is highly anxiety causing, that you can't have these things and you've got to go through and buy the expensive lipstick here because it says it's got no gluten in it, that the majority of people with celiac disease don't have to worry about.
Oh, goodness. Being in that position and seeing all of that and not knowing, is this the right answer? Is this not? What do I do? Can I still wear my favorite lipstick? Can I not? Can I wash my hair with shampoo? Can I not?
Yeah.
It would just be so overwhelming.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, Kim, what are 3 practical tips that you would give someone who is newly diagnosed with celiac disease to take on to manage their condition and have a positive outlook on life?
I'm really big on educating. Find out what celiac disease actually is, not just a gluten-free diet, you have to avoid wheat, rye, barley and oats. It's kind of like, what is the disease and how is it going to affect you and why am I needing to be gluten-free? If you can answer the why, you can get the motivation for going ahead and doing the diet. Finding somebody that can help you with reading a food label. Don't take it all on yourself. Find a dietitian who can take you through these steps and all of those things, reading a food label, what is trace gluten, what are some questions we need to ask at a restaurant, how do I communicate this with my family, how do I travel when I'm gluten-free. You need to be able to cover all of those sorts of things. And they have shown in an American study that the groups who socialise and continue to go out with people adjust far better to gluten-free than the people who think, I can't go anywhere now and I have to lock myself up inside the home because I don't know what questions I need to ask at the restaurant. I don't know how to be safe. So, or I don't want to run the risk because of whatever it needs to be. The people who can continue to socialise and work through that will have the better long-term health for celiac disease.
Kim, thank you so much. Such an informative podcast.
Thanks, Amal.
Any of our celiac listeners or those that may be experiencing symptoms thinking, could I not be? One,
don't take the wheat out.
Do not take your wheat out. Make sure you eat 2 to 4 slices of bread before testing. That's something that I did learn in this conversation. Have learned something from this because I know I have. And myself not being celiac doesn't apply to me, but I do have people in my friendship group that are celiac that I know am aware of how I can handle those situations as well. So Kim, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me on, Amal. This has been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you loved it as much as I loved being a part of it, and I'll see you at the next one.